I grew up in the typical American family. We had our full trust in our doctors. When we got sick, we knew the solution was to go to our doctor and get our medications, and that we knew that our health came from our doctors. We knew that if there was a bigger problem, that, well, he'd be able to take care of it. But I also knew one other thing, is that I knew that there was something special about the reason why I was here in this world, that I knew deep in my heart that I wanted to have a massive impact. I wanted to have a lasting impact, and I just didn't quite know what it was. And the beginning of my journey started when my sister was 12 years old. When she was 12 years old, she was diagnosed with cancer. Well, the solution to the cancer was drugs, and when that didn't work, we did radiation, and when that didn't work, it was more drugs, and then chemotherapy, and when that didn't work, there was surgery. When then that didn't work, the doctor said, we've done everything, it's really up to God now. She ended up dying, and I knew at that time, at that funeral, and I looked around and I saw my mother and my father, I saw my sisters and brothers, saw my aunts and my uncles, and we all have cousins and friends that something like this has affected. And I knew that my sister was out of pain at that time, but I also knew that we were still the ones that were suffering. We were still the ones that were in pain. And I realized that my family was no different than anybody else's family. And I knew that that was that moment, that one moment in my life that completely transformed all the rest, because I knew I needed to do something about it. I just didn't know what the answer was. This all changed once again when I met Dr. Guy Duran, and he told me two simple things. Dr. Duran was a chiropractor, and he said that you were born healthy, your body's designed to be healthy, it's not designed to be sick. The second thing that he told me was this, is that your health comes from your nervous system. Your nervous system controls your entire body. It controls how your body functions, how it heals, and how it regenerates. Literally, your entire experience in the world is experienced through your nervous system. And there was like an explosion that went off in my head that it was like that completely shifted my way of thinking. And when I shifted my way of thinking, I knew that I had to do one thing, and it's I had to get this message out to the world. Because I knew if I got this message out to the world, that it would not only affect one person, but it would affect families, and it would affect communities, and we'd have massive change there. And that's really what my whole story is about, is that the reason why I share the truth and I have the passion that I do is not because of my sister, and it's not because of what happened to me. It's because what I do know is this, is that I knew that inside of every single person is a potential for love, life, health, and healing. And I know that to be able to express this, to be able to experience this, that one thing has to happen. They have to know this truth, and they have to know a way to be able to apply this truth. And that's what my job is to be able to give people a choice. Whether they can have the life that they were designed to live, or to have a life of pain and suffering. And that's why I get up every single day. So I have to tell you guys, it's humbling to be here. And I actually thought about it. This whole event would not have occurred if it wasn't for my team. Does that make sense? Like they are the ones that did this today. But it wouldn't have actually been here if it wasn't for you guys. So you guys were the ones that created the event. Like by showing up and by doing the things that you needed to do, and by making sacrifices, you guys made the event there. And so I just want to have you guys give yourselves a little applause there, because you are the event. So, I forgot to take my gum out. Don't tell anybody. It's like number one rule of speaking, don't chew with gum, right? So this is actually a really exciting time for me, because I got up this morning and my son has a wrestling match today. And the two of us together, we were sitting getting our mindset right for what we're going to be doing. He's going to be going out, he's going to be doing battle, he's going to be on the mat, and it's going to be one-on-one. He's got to confront his fears. And I have to tell you that I have been really on edge about this makeover. I've been really nervous about it, because not only is it the start of the year, but what ends up happening is that I realize that this is my year to fight for people. this is my year to take it up to the next level here. And when the reason I was going through, and we're kind of cleaning up right now, and I found some wedding pictures. And I found my wedding pictures with my dad, but none of my other sisters and brothers got to have wedding pictures with my dad. I'm the only one. And so this event is for people so that they can actually, fathers can be at weddings, and grandkids can have their grandparents at weddings. And that's what this is about. This isn't about weight loss. It's a side effect. See, side effect of weight loss is actually getting healthy. And so today we're going to do a couple different things. Number one, we're going to go through a whole bunch of new information that you've never heard before, hopefully, but it'll be transformative. But at the second part, we're going to have a break, and we'll give you a chance to get your resources, because the thing that I need you to understand is this, is that my goal for you at the end of this is, number one, is that you can go and teach it to somebody else. Because if you can't teach it, you don't know it. And if you don't know it, then you'll never apply it. And so if you can teach it to somebody else, if you can speak this information to somebody else, what's going to end up happening is that you're going to be able to take action yourself. That's my second goal, is that you'll be able to have the tools to be able to take action and take it up to the next level. And then my third goal, right, is for you guys to realize is that nobody's going to come and save you. Okay? Nobody's going to save you. If you're on a deserted island, there's two types of people. Number one, if your boat crashes and you're sitting on the edge of you swim ashore, there's two types of people. Number one, the first type of person sits there and they're waiting for the boat to come to save them. And they sit there, and eventually they're going to starve. The other person says, nobody's going to come and save me. I have to take 100% responsibility for my life. And what they do is they go and they collect wood, and they figure out how to make fire, even if they've never made fire before, and so they can have a signal fire. They go make shelter. They go find go find food and water there. And so the difference is not the resources that we have; it's how resourceful we're going to have with those resources that we have. You guys have everything that you ever needed on the inside of you. All we have to do is to bring it out there. And so today, as we move forward, what I want you to be able is just that we gave you a pen and paper. I actually wrote a book just for today, so that a lot of times people are like, well, I learned a lot of stuff, read it. Everything, I tried to summarize everything in here for you, but not only that, there's another 120 pages. I know Vanessa talked about it, but we put together a Dropbox link for you. So not only is the book on there, but I put it 120 days of one-page readings for you to be able to support you in your process. So it's a continuing education, not just a one-day education there. So if we're able to put a little bit at a time to have a deeper understanding, what will happen is over time, this will become normal for you. There's also handouts in there. There's all the resources that you need. So all you have to do is drop, and as things come up, I'll put it in there, and you can just keep going back to it. So here's what it's about. Let's talk about weight loss. Because basically people think weight loss is, if somebody has weight, they're one of two things. They're either a sloth, they don't move, or they're a glutton. They just eat too much, right? Like that's kind of the fat shaming thing that we look about. Like if you're fat, it's because you eat too much, or if you don't move enough. And it affects our self-worth of who we are, because we think that there's something wrong with us. Like, and has anybody ever tried to lose weight, by the way? Okay, just want to make sure that we're on the same page. Like almost everybody has tried, and almost everybody has failed, and then we try again, and then we start to beat ourselves up there. And so my job today is this: when you start thinking about it, like if you have a small win, what ends up happening is you start to feel like a winner. Does that make sense? And then if we can get enough small wins, then we actually start to see ourselves as a winner. We start to do things that a winner does. And that's what my goal is today, is I need to break down this whole sloth or gluttony thing so we can completely let go of that. We're actually going to try to destroy a whole bunch of myths today. So the first one is this, and this wasn't meant to be like a weird picture, but these are the Prima Indians. And the Prima Indians, they were actually lived on the plains. They were when they had from the National History Museum, they went out there and they looked at them in the 1850s. And they found that they were one of the most healthy people that were out there. They lived off the land. They hunted for about 80% of the food that they had. They had virtually no disease. Most of the people, as Indians, lived well close to their hundreds, but they didn't even know their real birth date. There was almost no vision problems, no heart disease. There was no, basically people would just get old and fall asleep and never wake up. Well, then what happened is that we had this great idea. What we need to do is we need to remove the Indians to the reservations. Their genes didn't change,
but their shape did. See, one of the things that we think of is that obesity is a thing of being overnourished. Actually, it's a thing of being undernourished. See, we're undernourishing our body, and our body is starving there. What they did is, instead of taking them from their natural habitat, what they did is they started to give them like gifts of flour and sugar. And what they found is that the Indians started to become obese. They started to become much more sedentary. Instead of moving around every single day, they became sedentary, and they started to gain weight. They started to have diabetes that never existed. They started to have heart disease that never existed. They started to have cancer that never existed in these tribes. And in fact, if you look at the Indian reservations to this day, it's one of the sickest populations that are out there, even though genetically just 100 years ago, they were one of the healthiest populations. See, what we have to look at is over the last millennia, right now, our society that we live in is 1% of 1,000th of a percent of the amount of time that humans have been in existence. Yet we radically changed our lifestyles there. We have diseases that would never even existed in humankind. And so what we have to realize is that we have to take responsibility, because nobody's going to save us if we don't get back to common sense. And so a lot of times we also look at, well, have you ever been in Walmart or something like that, and you see a large mom and a small child? This is actually the largest mom ever to deliver a healthy baby there. So we look at this and we say, well, maybe it's that the mom is eating all the food and not giving the child food. Does that make sense? No. Like, that would have to violate every single thing of being a mother to say that the mother is stealing food from the child. So what we have to look at is that there's something physiologically going on. Mothers aren't going to violate their internal codes. Something has to happen in our body there. Oh, I hit the wrong button. There we go. So then what we do is we go and we look at the Women's Health Study. And so the Women's Health Study is this brilliant study, and they took 50,000 women over 8 years. And what they looked at is they looked at all different types of things, and they keep on pulling information from it. And what they did is they took 20,000 women, and what they did is they had them reduce their caloric intake by 360 calories per day. That's a great idea. Well, what was the long-term results there? The results were a 2-pound weight loss in approximately 8 years. That's not good. Does that make sense? Most people consider that a failed diet there. See, if you were to do the math on that, there's 360 calories and 3,500 calories in a pound. They should have lost that 2 pounds in 3 weeks. They should be losing approximately, if we round that off every month, they should be losing about 4 pounds, let's say. 3 pounds. That should be 36 pounds a year. In 8 years, that's like 300 and what? 36 pounds in 8 years, that's about, 3/8, let's just say about 360 pounds or so, right? It should not be in existence if it was just about 360, if it was about the 300 calories. So the math doesn't work, right? This whole calorie in, calorie out. Has anybody ever been on a calorie restricted diet? Where like, we're just going to cut our calories down and I should get thin. Well, that's really great, because if you're on it really works well if you're on a deserted island. Like, right, if there's no food on a deserted island and you're on a caloric restricted diet, it's actually going to work, because you'll actually get thinner, and then what'll happen is somebody rescues you. Guess what's going to happen? Right? And does anybody ever had the flu and then they lose a whole bunch of weight and they're like, oh, check this out, my new diet plan, right? And then what happens? We regain it right back. So there's something that happens in our brain, because our brain always wants to actually have a certain amount of weight. Like, there's a reason why your body's incredibly intelligent. There's a reason why we are the weight that we are. And so when we look at the next myth is about exercise. And we think that, well, maybe we're just not eating enough, because we think that if we have weight, what we need to do is if we're exercising a lot, then we must be eating too much, and if we're eating too much, well, then we're probably not exercising enough. And so what they found is that in the 70s, up until the 70s, basically people didn't exercise, right? Like the concept in the 50s of going out and getting sweaty didn't exist. Like, nobody, you have gym classes, but nobody wanted to get sweaty. Nobody said, hey, I'm going to go run 10 miles a day. And so all of a sudden in the 80s, we had 100,000 people working out on a regular basis in the United States. But do you know what happened to the average weight of the people in the United States in the 80s started to go up. How could that be? If it was just about exercise, we should all be losing weight and getting thinner, but instead we started to get heavier there. And so the guidelines say that we need to have 90 minutes a day of rigorous exercise just to maintain the weight 3 times a week, to be able to maintain the weight that we actually have. Does anybody here on a consistent basis, then you don't have to raise your hands, but like you have 90 minutes a day, and are we doing that? No, but for the most part, we're all maintaining our weight, right? So there has to be something. So we start to find out that what the government says, what the researchers say, what the traditional way of thinking says, there's all these conflicts. And we're like, okay, so if we starve ourselves, we don't lose weight. And if we exercise, we don't lose weight. But if they say we have to exercise 90 minutes a day, that's all we have to do to maintain weight. But all these things aren't adding up, because it's not about these things. It's not an outside-in approach there. By the way, this was a fascinating one when they studied runners. And they said that if somebody runs to lose weight, for the most part, what they find, if they run 2 miles a day, 5 days a week, that's 10 miles a week. If somebody does that in their 20s, they'll actually maintain their weight. Most people don't lose their weight, because what happens when you start to exercise? You get what? You get hungrier, right? Isn't that interesting? So we exercise, and then have you ever done that? Like, you get hungry. I have a friend of mine that works over at City Sports, and he says the biggest problem in his as a personal trainer is that people go and they exercise and they come out of City Sports that's down on Coleman. And do you know what's right over there also? In-N-Out Burger. And have you ever come out of Lowe's and smelled In-N-Out Burger? So literally people walk out of their exercise, their calories, their energy levels are low, they smell In-N-Out Burger, and they go through the drive-through. They don't even go through the walk-through there. And then they come back and they can't figure out why they're not losing weight. So what they found, though, is when they study runners, is that if you run 10 miles a week, when you're in your 20s, to maintain that same level of weight, you have to double it in your 30s. So now you have to run 20 miles a week in your 30s. And to maintain that same level of weight loss of your weight in your 40s, you have to double it again. So now you're running 40 miles a week. And in your 50s, you have to double it again there. Does anybody have that amount of time? Like to be running 50 miles a week in your 50s, right? Like even at a 10-minute mile, that's a lot of time there. And think about the wear and tear. And so we're going to break down that myth because of aerobic exercise, because it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Because if you've ever been to the gym and seen the treadmills lined up, and there's men and women on the treadmill, and they're just religious about being there. And they look the same January 1st that they do in June 1st and December 1st when they gain those extra weight. See, what we find out is if aerobic exercise worked in the way that we were told that it works, we would actually all be thin and healthy there. Maybe just going for a brisk walk and doing that type of thing. And that's what I'm going to teach you how to understand this, and that's why we need to go into such a deep level there. How about our sedentary lifestyle? So what they did is, which is interesting, is they said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to test this, and they train marathon runners. Has anybody ever trained for a marathon? That's intensive, right? They literally took couch potatoes, people that were obese and overweight, and what they did is they said, we're going to teach you how to run a marathon. So what they did, they spent 18 months training them to run a marathon from beginning to end. The average weight loss, 5 pounds. The average weight loss was 5 pounds. Have you ever gone to the Rock and Roll Half Marathon? And my wife and I always sit there and cheer the runners on. But the one thing that we always say to ourselves, we should be out there doing it. If they can do it, we can do it. There's people 3-4 times my size out there running that half marathon, and I stand in amazement there, and they've been training and training and training, and they haven't lost the weight there. How is it that you can be a runner like that and not lose the weight? And so maybe it has something that doesn't have to do just with exercise there. And that's really what and I'm trying to create some conflicts in your mind. You're like, wait, you're telling me everything that I know to be right is wrong, or maybe it just misapplied. So look at this. This is one of my favorite ones. It's what we call the calorie myth. So if somebody was to just reduce 20 calories per day from their diet, every year they would actually lose 2 pounds. And in 25 years, they would actually lose approximately 24 pounds. Or maybe if they increase 20 calories a day in 24 years, they'd have 24 extra pounds. So think about this, micromanaging your diet for just 20 calories. Like think about, if you ever see like an animal in the wild that has a kill, right? And he's not going to ever go in there and just stop right in the middle and go, oh, I maxed out on my calories at that particular time, right? Like a cow out grazing, like when do they stop grazing? They're like, oh, I'm done right now. But they don't get fat. Why is that? Why is that you don't see like a lion out there being like fat and overweight, and you don't see like a cow being fat and overweight that grazes all day long? See, our bodies are designed to regulate ourselves. They have feedback mechanisms that tell us when to stop eating and when to start eating there. It's all been pre-designed there. And the problem is that when it becomes an issue of regulation, so think about this, if this person right here has just 1 cup of Chex Mix, well that's 240 calories. Just that extra cup of Chex Mix a week. They've already blown through, they're going to gain 24 pounds in a year. So we have to really look at that. So when was the last time we saw a cow grazing? But there has to be something other than calories. And really what I'm going to be talking about is this, is the law of thermodynamics, the calorie in, calorie out thing. And it's interesting why we use the law of thermodynamics that says that, the law of thermodynamics says is that you have energy into a system and you have energy out of a system, right? And so if you need more energy on this end, you need to have more energy on this end. Well, why don't we use the law of relativity or any other physical law when we're talking about weight loss in the human body? Because it just seemed to work right there, but it basically says energy, unless energy energy is either created or destroyed, but it can only change from one form to another. So we think that when we shake a potato and we eat it, and then that potato becomes this bump that's right over here on our hip, right? It's either stored, it's just transferred there. So the more you eat, the more you expend, the more you get fat. Well then, here's the thing. I want you to think about this. Imagine in this room right here. And there's only one exit to this building, so if there is a fire, it's over there, just so you know. But the point is this, is that let's say we keep on having people come into this room, okay? And then there's no other exit. Eventually this room is going to be crowded. And we're going to say, well, the room's crowded, but we don't ask why the people keep coming into the room. And that's really the question is why does our body keep on pulling in calories there? Why does that happen? Why do we become more crowded in our body? Why do we overeat? Why do we get fatter? Those are the questions that we need to discuss. Not that we are fat, but the questions of why, the big whys of these things. Because if you can understand the whys, you can understand the hows of how to fix it. So what I want you to... I got a new clicker here. So this is one of my favorite studies, and you might have heard me talk about it a little bit this week or last week, and it's called Wade's rats. So Wade was a researcher, and what he did was, and I feel sorry for the rats that he had, but Wade took these rats and he removed their ovaries. And then what he found was, and then he put them back into a cage, and he found these rats got very obese. And he said to himself, maybe, and he took it actually one step further. He actually asked a question that nobody else really does. He said, well, maybe why did those rats get obese? And they started eating and eating and eating and eating and eating and eating and eating. And he said, maybe there's something to do with why they're eating. So what he ended up doing then is he took another set of rats and he measured the amount of food that they had eaten before the surgery. And then after the surgery, they actually gave them the same amount of food. And guess what happened to the rats? They got fat. But how could they get fat when they were given the same amount of food? See, there had to be another question. And so when we understand the physiology of our body, there's a protein called LPL. It's called lipoprotein lipase. And what happens is that LPL's job is to take energy and convert it into fat. So what I want you to think about is if you have like a pipe. So imagine there's a pipe coming in here, and we think this pipe is our energy intake, and then there's actually another pipe that comes out. This is the energy that we expend. And so we think that this is equal to this, Well, what he found is that there's a third way. It's a T-junction, actually. See, the body says that what I want to do is always have a store of energy over here. And so with the lipoprotein lipase, what it did is the job of estrogen will actually prevent lipoprotein lipase from actually pulling in energy from the bloodstream and putting it into fat. So what ended up happening was that when he did the surgery, he kept the same amount of energy coming in over here. The body says, well, now there's nothing keeping that lipoprotein lipase from becoming activated. So all the energy was going in the fat cells. And so then guess what the rats did? The only time that they moved, when it was time for them to get food, they decreased their energy. Interesting. So have you ever been on a diet and then did you really feel like exercising? No. See, it's about, like when you have energy coming in, your body, like if you decrease the energy coming in, you're going to decrease the energy on the back end there. So if we increase the energy over here, a lot of times that's why people, when they exercise more, they'll actually start to, like eat more. So but we also have to understand that it's about physiology there. See, what about the rats? What about teenage boys? Well, what I'll show you is this. You have to understand that the fat 101 is what we'll call it there. Body fat is carefully regulated. It's your reserve. I want you to think of it as a wallet, okay? It's not a safe. It's not a deposit box. It's a wallet. As you go through the day, or maybe think that you pay out money, and then you take in money, you pay out money, and you take in money, you pay out money. See, in the morning, all day long, your body is saving fat, and at night, when you're not eating, it's burning fat. That's its job, just to keep that energy balance there. So what ends up happening is it knows what to do. The problem is when there's a defect in that process, something's interfering with that process. And that's what you'll find with the human body. Anytime there's an interference in the human body, there's going to be a problem. And that's what we start to see when it comes to being up weight. So what makes us fatter will also make us overeat. So watch this. This right here is my son. Okay? Pretty cute. That's his Halloween costume, but he ended up wearing it for like 6 months after that because he really liked it. You know, that's kind of what they do. So here's my son now. So currently, my son's 16 years old, and he overeats. And guess what else teenage boys do? They oversleep too. Does that make sense? Have you ever noticed, like, if you had a teenage boy, all they do is want to eat and sleep, eat and sleep, eat and sleep, eat and sleep 24 hours a day, and you're like, what's wrong with them? You know what I mean? Like, how can you eat that much, and then how can you sleep that much? I think he went to bed at 8:30 this morning, and I had to last night, and I had to pull him out of bed this morning. There, like last time I got 12 hours of sleep or 10 hours of sleep, I can't even remember. Well, the problem is that if he's eating 10 times more than he ate 10 times more now than he used to eat. So is he eating to get fat, or is he eating to grow? See, that's what the purpose of eating for him is to actually grow. Now the thing is that if we're growing, there's a reason why we're growing. We can be growing as a teenage boy, but we can also be growing wide as an adult. So, it's not a physical thing. There's not a character defect in him. Does that make sense? He doesn't have a problem. He doesn't have a mindset issue. He doesn't have issues with, like food. It's just a biologic drive. And what I need you to understand, there's a biologic drive in you to grow. The problem is that when there's an interference in that where there's a regulatory defect, weight gain is not about your mindset. It's not about willpower. It's not about weakness. It's about what's happening in your brain there. And that's a major factor. If I can take the pressure off of you, that there's nothing wrong with you as a human being, as a living person, there's something wrong with the regulation of how your body takes in energy there. What's interesting, though, is that if you think about a woman, and so when we're pregnant, guess what happens? Where do we gain the weight the most? Well, kind of right here, right? And in the thighs, usually, right? And so guess what? And when we're pregnant, lipoprotein lipase, it becomes the thing that keeps you from gaining weight in the hips it goes away. And so all of a sudden lipoprotein lipase increases in the hips and in the gluteal region there. And so what happened, the reason being is the body's so intelligent that it uses that as energy for when the mother's nursing. After birth, guess what happens? It changes that it's not inhibited in the breast. So all of a sudden we have more fat in the breast there for nursing there. That's how brilliant your body is there. When women, they have a tendency to have the receptors for lipoprotein lipase concentrated down from the hips down. Men have it concentrated from here to here. But as testosterone goes, the estrogen, it prevents that lipoprotein lipase from becoming activated. So my wife, she plays tennis 5 days a week. She looks around, she's been doing it for a long time. She looks at all of her friends. They all keep the same amount of energy, exercise up, and she looks at all of her friends, and they're all gaining weight. They can't figure out what's going on as they're going through menopause, right? And they're like, what's wrong with me? Well, as the estrogen levels go down as we get older, all of a sudden that LPL isn't inhibited, and so every bit of energy that's coming in is getting converted into fat. Oh, by the way, when estrogen goes down, then all of a sudden your testosterone levels are more prominent. So that's why women, as we get older, we start to gain weight right around the stomach here. And we're like, I've never had a belly before. How come I have a belly now? That makes absolutely no sense. It's biologic. And so what we're going to do is teach you why that happens and how to prevent that from happening. So just really the main thing is that we don't get fat because we overeat. We overeat because we're fat. And that's a weird way to think about it. We don't get fat because we overeat. We overeat because we're fat. So how does that work? So basically, Zucker, what he ended up doing is he said, well, he actually had these rats. And these rats right here, this is a Zucker rat, and this is a normal-sized rat. Do you guys see any difference? Yeah. Okay, there's a big difference right there. So what they did is the Zucker rats, what they ended up doing is they immediately, when the rats were born, they actually weaned them away. And so that as a baby will nurse as much as it possibly can, but they weaned them away and they limited their intake of food, which is sad for the rats, but I'm glad it's not us, but I'm glad. The point is that the rats continue to get obese. The rats continue to get obese. How is that? Like you have a rat that's had that the increase in calories reduced, and then continue to get obese there. And what's even more interesting is because there's a biologic drive in the body, those rats, it actually pulled the energy from the organs. It pulled it from the muscles. So the muscles and the organs actually wasted away. That's why those rats died, and they died obese and fat. How is that? How is that? Well, what's interesting is that when they autopsied them and they compared them to other rats there, a vast majority of their bodies were fat and their organs literally had atrophied. Their muscles literally had atrophied. And they didn't know why that was. So what I want to do is I want you to understand where we are, what we can do about how we can change it. Because you have to understand this. And if you understand this one slide, you're going to understand everything else that we're going to talk about today. So we're going to sit on this for a little bit of time because it's incredibly important. So first thing is, think about your favorite sweet right now. Just think about it in your mind. Just close your eyes. See it, taste it, touch it. Okay, now, just so you know, you actually just released insulin into your system. Okay? You just released insulin into your system. So the Pavlov, his dogs, has anybody ever heard of Pavlov's dogs? Yeah. So Pavlov's dogs, Pavlov would come out and he'd feed them, and then when he'd feed them, he'd ring a bell. And then the dogs would start to salivate there. Well, what they found was eventually, at the same time of the day, they would see Pavlov without even any food, and they would start to salivate. And then what they found was that he would come out every day at the same time. They would start thinking about food. They would start salivating because they were, all their digestive glands, all their insulin would be released. So the first thing that happens is we begin to, anytime that we think about food, we actually start to release insulin. Now, the problem is this, is that when do we think about food? Pretty much 24/7, right? We wake up in the morning like, what's for breakfast? And then you watch TV, right? And what do you see like half the time on there? You know, $6 sloppy hamburgers that come down drizzling, right? You know, like French fries, and we're like, hey, ice cream, it's great. And you know, like our whole, we're marketed to 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we look through magazines, and you know, we have magazines about food, right? We're like, whoa, look at that, that would really taste good. And then, you know, like you walk into a supermarket, what do they say? Never walk into a supermarket, right? Because guess what's going to happen? You're going to buy everything, and you're going to be eating it while you're in the supermarket, right? So the first thing is that we think about it, we actually will start to secrete insulin into our system there. Now, here's an interesting thing about that. When insulin goes into our system, what it does, it immediately starts to lower our blood sugar levels, okay? And what it also does is any blood sugar that's in there, what typically will happen is when we have sugar come into our body, your body will fill up your muscles, it'll fill up your liver with as much sugar as it possibly can, it'll fill up your cells with as much sugar as it possibly can. And then what ends up happening is that insulin's job is it'll start a process where it breaks down those sugars and converts them into triglycerides. They will eventually convert them into triglycerides, which is what the storage form of fat. See, that's what that LPL does too, because when we have high insulin, we have high LPL also, that fat depositing hormone. So we think about food, and immediately the insulin comes up, and immediately our body starts depositing whatever energy there is in our bloodstream into fat. So just thinking about cookies makes you fat. Think about that. That's crazy. So what also happens is that because it wants to clear out the bloodstream of energy, because energy, like too much sugar, is toxic in our bloodstream. There, literally, a teaspoon of sugar in your bloodstream is toxic to you. So your body wants to clear that out to protect you, and to also make room for more energy coming in there. So then what happens is fat signals are signaled to shut down the release of HSL, which is the opposite of LPL. Well, the HSL, what it does is it takes the triglycerides, releases the storage form of fat, releases them into fatty acids, which your body uses for energy. And I'm sorry for getting scientific on you, but I'll get through this, but I need you to understand how this process works. So then what ends up happening is so any fatty acids that we have in there, any fat that we have floating around that we use for energy, any carbohydrates that we have floating around in our bloodstream, the moment that we start having insulin released, all of a sudden now we immediately start to have low blood sugar. And then what happens is that we get more hungry, and then we eat. Well, the moment that we put something into our mouth, our body also spikes insulin. So have you ever had that first bite and you're hungry, and then you keep eating? Does that make sense? Like that, does that first bite or the last bite taste best? Have you ever noticed that? Like if you have those, my son once had this package, and it was a package of pretzel peanut butter, the trans fat, gooey things. Okay, let's make it Girl Scout season right now. Okay, let's make it that better. Thin Mint chips. When was the last time anybody ever had one Thin Mint? Right? We have the whole package. That's what they're there for. It's a fully loaded. It's like a Pez dispenser, right? So we're just do. But even by the time we get to the end of it, it doesn't really taste that good by the end of the package. But our brain's like, we must eat this. So what ends up happening is, as we eat, we secrete more insulin, and then carbs start to become digested and enter our circulation as glucose. And guess what it does? It increases the insulin again. So now we further shut down our body's ability to actually burn fat, and we start the insulin goes in there to lower the blood sugar there. Fat from the diet stored as triglycerides in the cells. The fat cells get fatter, and so do you. Fat stays in the cells until insulin levels drop. So that's how the process works. So the interesting thing also is that as we're going through this process, as we start to eat and blood sugar starts coming in, we start to the insulin will actually dull down your brain. It'll dull down your taste buds. So that's why that first bite tastes so good, and the last bite doesn't taste as good, because your brain is saying you don't need to keep eating there at that point there. But the problem is that as we're eating high carbohydrate diets, insulin goes up more, and then we crash our blood sugar even more. And so we have to really look at the impact that carbohydrates have on us and insulin. And that's really what it's going to be about today, is we're going to be talking a lot about insulin there. All right, so what is this? Does anybody know? Okay, I know. I had this picture sitting on the counter, and people were like, oh my gosh. Like, what website has he been on, right? Okay, so what this is right here is an injection site for a diabetic. See, what happens is that a diabetic injects themselves typically in the same place every single day. So this person injected themselves in their stomach. This person right here injected themselves in their legs. Every single day, twice a day, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, when they would actually inject themselves. So they're putting insulin right specifically into an area, interfering with that LPL being able to act, your body's ability to release fat from tissue there. And so that, guess what happens? We start to build up fat right in those areas there. This is what they call it, lipohypertrophy there. Isn't that fascinating? So imagine if you have high levels of insulin throughout your whole body, preventing your body from burning fat and actually converting the sugar into fat. And guess what you're going to end up being? Fat, right? And so, if I shoot anybody with my laser on here, I apologize. I just found out I had it. So what I want you to start thinking about is that this is like a gauge. Next time you're in your car, this is what we call a brain tattoo. Like I wanted to tattoo this on your brain. So every time you look at your gas tank and you want to see if you're empty or full, you're going to have to reverse engineer this in your brain. What I want you to think of, this is energy and this is fat. Okay? Energy and fat. So when we have energy, what ends up happening is that we have food coming in, and we have and that food is able to be converted immediately over into energy in the body. So you look at a marathon runner, right? Those people that, or if you ever seen somebody with boundless energy, what they do is that whatever food that they take immediately comes in and it's transferred to energy in which they can go do good works in this world. They can go exercise, they can go do things there. But what happens is that any time we have insulin in there, what we do is we change the needle, and it moves us into the fat realm there. And then as we decrease insulin, we ended up going in this direction. And here's the interesting thing, is that we have about 40 hormones in our body. We really have one hormone that will actually lower blood sugar. All the rest of them pretty much increase blood sugar, with the exception of cortisol, by the way. And cortisol is kind of an interesting thing, is that when somebody has cortisol, it can do both. It can lower and raise blood sugar. And but the big determiner is, that's why, have you ever noticed somebody that, like, when they're under stress, what do they get? Like some people, when they're under stress, what do? They eat, right? Tons, right? And they get fat. Oh, I'm just under stress, so I eat. Or other people, when they're under stress, what do? They lose weight, right? The determiner whether somebody gets fat or loses weight when they're under stress is actually based on their insulin sensitivity. Like how much exposure that they've had. Because when there's high levels of insulin in somebody's body and they have high levels of cortisol, they'll get fat. When there's low levels of insulin and they have high levels of cortisol, they'll actually get thin. Because what ends up happening is that it's all about the LPL and the HSL there. Which one, if you're going to release the fat from your fat cells, or you're going to put the fat in your fat cells there. So really looking at, if we're tipping the needle in this direction, we know that primarily it's just an issue of insulin. How do we drop that those insulin levels down there? Well, here's an interesting thing. So we think that maybe it's just my genetics, right? You know, my mom was fat, my mom's big bone, so on and so forth. What they did, and this was really fascinating, they actually did a study in which they took mothers that had bariatric surgery, where they actually got the gastric bypass surgery there. And what they ended up doing was they looked at the genes of their children before the surgery, and they actually looked at the genes of their children after the surgery. Pretty cool. What they actually found is that there was over 5,500 different genes in between those two children before and after the surgery. And look at this. What they found was that it turned off the genes of the gene expression that for things like insulin resistance the people that actually the children after had less insulin resistance, lower blood pressure, improved cardiovascular disease risk profile compared to the children that they had before the surgery. So what ends up happening after somebody's had gastric bypass surgery? Well, they have to really radically change their diet, right? They have to radically change their insulin sensitivity in their body. They just can't go eat a loaf of bread anymore. They just can't go out and drink the alcohols and have the same amount of food. They have to have the smaller meals there afterwards, but also their body becomes, the insulin levels go down in those people. So literally, it's not just about us. We literally, the choices that we make if you're a mother will actually affect our children, and what they're actually finding is that it actually goes 4 generations. So if you're 25 years old right now, and you're making decisions whether you want to keep your insulin levels low, whether weight has anything to do with anything, why don't you check with not your children, not your grandchildren, but your great-grandchildren, and see what they think. Because the choices that we make today will affect 4 generations. Isn't that incredible? And so this is, like imagine being able to turn on or off gene expression for chronic deteriorative diseases. Now let's go backwards in time. Let's go back 4 generations and start to see what happened 4 generations ago. Now the scary thing is that our great-grandparents, they had a completely different lifestyle than we did, right? They didn't have processed food, they didn't have Mickey D's, they didn't have all these different things. So we're at an obesity epidemic, and we're not even cresting right now. We're just starting up this hill. That's the scary thing that we want to look at there. So, oh, I hit the wrong way, didn't I? So foods that make us fat are the ones we're most likely to crave. That's interesting. The things that make us fat. Have you ever noticed that? Like nobody that actually, what they find us is that when people actually have when they're overweight, they don't crave like a hamburger with lettuce on it. They crave the hamburger with lettuce in the bun. In fact, they get very little pleasure because it doesn't raise the insulin levels the same way. Your brain doesn't think of protein as raising your insulin levels. Your brain actually only thinks as a bun, and that's where we get the craving for a hamburger or french fries. So what's interesting is that foods that make us fat are the ones that we're less likely to crave. The thinking will actually drive the nutrients into storage. We get decreased energy into our circulation. We start to become hungry. This hunger increases with each the bite that we start to take as the insulin levels start to go up. The greater the insulin response, the better that we think it tastes, because it creates more hunger. So that's why, like, you know, if you have like cereal and you're eating like just, let's say, you know, like bran or something like that, right? As opposed to Fruit Loops. Like Fruit Loops, you can't stop eating there because they just taste so good, because it drives their sugar response up so much higher there, as opposed to somebody being able to eat walnuts, right? The walnuts aren't going to affect sugar the same way. Over time, insulin decreases as the insulin raises. Food doesn't taste as good, and so the insulin will suppress our appetite. But basically, the main thing that I need you to understand is that sugar triggers our brain's reward cascade. We feel reward when we actually eat sugar. In fact, it's the same brain reward cascade that is triggered when we take cocaine. Same brain reward cascade when we take heroin. So that's the same. Any of those opioids, we look at the opioid epidemic that we're having right now, it could be just as easily saying that, hey, more people are dying from the sugar epidemic as opposed to the opioid epidemic. We need to start a task force on sugar, the other white powder, as opposed to a task force on opioids. More people die from sugar than ever have from opioids all put together there. And by the way, the industry on both sides is just as committed to selling you their product. The opioid epidemic, no doctor was sitting there saying, I got a great idea. Why don't you say that we give our patients heroin? You know what I mean? Like that wasn't, but that's like that's the same thing. It was a corporate decision, because what we have to remind ourselves is that the way that the corporations make their money is by making sure that you buy their product, and not just buy their product, but eat their product on a repetitive basis. So if their product stimulates that brain reward cascade on you and raises those insulin levels as quickly, you're going to eat more of it and you're going to buy it more often. So then what ends up happening is, so the USDA, where did this all start to go wrong? Well, in the 60s, the USDA came up with what we call our food pyramid there. So if you get rid of one thing, you're going to have to increase another thing. So look at what the base foundation of the USDA's food pyramid was. grains, breads, pastas, cereals, right? That was the foundation in the 60s of what we could do. So guess what all those things do? What do they raise? They raise insulin, and guess what high insulin makes us? Okay, so then they say the next thing that you should have is lots of fruits and vegetables. Fruit is high in sugar, and so guess what high sugar does? It raises and makes us okay. And then what happens is then we have a lot of vegetables here, which have a lot of good carbohydrates in there. And one of the things you have to understand that I love vegetables, and we'll go into this later, but there's still carbohydrates in there. So we look at this, and then you can come up here with, now your proteins are the smallest part, and then we come all the way up here to the fats. By the way, it's impossible to get fat by eating fat.
No.
It's just, you can't raise your insulin levels. Think about that. So like, I was reading a book, and this guy had postulated, he said, well, what if you eat, like you go on the butter diet, right? And I'll challenge you guys, that's like, does anybody want to volunteer for the butter diet? Because I guarantee you'll have massive loss of weight. It's impossible not to lose weight, because what happens is that fat doesn't raise your insulin levels there. Now the problem is, it's not a lifestyle. Like sticking on the butter diet, like the first time you have a bite, you're like, okay, I'm going to take the Kerrygold stuff and put a little lava salt on there. But 3 days into the butter diet, I guarantee you, well, you'll be in a ketogenic state, but you'll also like get off of it. So, but the interesting thing is that we can't gain weight when we're eating. When we're eating fat, we can only gain weight when we're eating carbohydrates. But the problem is that when we have too many carbohydrates there, the fats will be stored as fat. So if we eliminate this, and if we eliminate most of this, or what if we just flip the pyramid upside down? So this has got us to where we're 30% obese in the United States right now, following their food program. What if the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different result? What if we completely flip that pyramid upside down and say, we're going to try something different? Maybe what we need to do is we need to, when they looked at, and this is kind of an interesting thing, when they actually studied our ancestors, the people before the 1% of 1,000th of a percent of time, there's 229 tribes that are still around right now. And when they studied them, what they found is of those indigenous tribes, people that have been isolated, that have been living the same way for thousands of years, that had very little disease, very little chronic disease, very little problems, what they found is that most of them consumed high amounts of animal foods, meaning that they ate fish and meat. And what they actually preferred is they actually preferred the organs. They actually preferred the tongue. They actually preferred the bone marrow there. They didn't leave any of the fat behind. They didn't cut the fat off of their meat. Does that make sense? They weren't like, okay, I want the leanest cut. They wanted the fattiest cut of meat because that's what gave them substance. That's what gave them energy there. So right now, typically in the United States, we're 15% fat, 30% protein, 50% carbohydrates. The average when they studied like people in their natural environment, they were actually 60% fat, 30% protein, and 10% carbohydrates. So where did the information come? That's what we have here. That makes us fat, sick, and nearly dead. This is what created the people for thousands of years. Even if they got it wrong for 100 years or 500 years or 1,000 years, you'd figure after several thousand years, these tribes would actually get it right, right? Well, we've been working with this for the last 40 years. Obviously, there's something that's gotten wrong there. The one thing that they also had is they had very low carbohydrates. Most of their carbohydrates were less than 15% and 85% of the populations that were studied there. Almost none of the populations that were vegetarian. Natural populations were vegetarian. Isn't that interesting? That like when you're having to live off the land rather than out of a refrigerator, you make different choices there. So, there's the study right there, sorry. So here we are. We got the United States at 30%. We have Canada at 22%. And then what ends up happening is that we have France over here. Well, isn't that the home of the French fry, right? You know what I mean? Like how is it that they have, there's something called the French paradox. In France, like they eat lots of cheese, they eat lots of bread, but they don't eat, they have their desserts, but they don't eat a lot, they have a lot of fat in their diet. Why is Italy so thin? Aren't they like pasta and pizza and, you know, like the good stuff, right? Well, they also have a lot of vegetables, and so we have to really look at it. Maybe it's not just the main things, but there's some really keys that we're going to look at. So here's the thing about Maximize Living, that when we ended up, how this all came about is we were sitting around and we were looking at the people that were sick. We were looking at our patient populations. We said, you know what, we got to do something about this. We're like, what is it that we're going to do that will actually make people healthy? What can we do? And we literally scoured, we came down and we're like, look, there's probably 5 essential things that we can really focus on. If we can focus on these 5 essential things, then I think what we can do is we can actually turn the tide here. And that's what Maximize Living is all about. It's about turning the tide of where we're going. So we're going to run through a couple things because this is why we changed it. Because we look at, the United States takes more drugs than any other country in the world. And what they find is that the drug prices are going up. And we also find out the number one and 2 causes of bankruptcy are medical bills and divorce. So when we typically find many times most divorces are about financial issues, right? So even Dave Ramsey would say, like this is a bad plan for staying out of bankruptcy there. But what we start to find, we're the highest in the world, psychotropic, dementia, respiratory, rheumatoid arthritis issues. So the question is, are we going in the right direction?
You're going the wrong
You guys ever see planes, trains, and automobiles? Okay. Bert Pharma says that right now we're having more and more chronic diseases, so we're prescribing more and more medications to try to treat these more and more chronic diseases.
You're going the wrong
Right? How about this? Trends in prescription drug use. We should be getting